The lecture is about cultural diplomacy in conflict zones. My name is Nazar Al Baharna. Conflicts are usually sorted out by two methods, either by forceful intervention or by mediation. Now, history shows that both methods have not been very effective in dealing with or sorting out conflicts. Because if we look at mediation usually is between the main stakeholders of the conflicting in a conflict area. For example, it's the government and the opposition. While the main source of conflicts are the people themselves. So if we take, for example, Sudan as an example, we see that although they have arrived to some sort of agreement between the government and the opposition, and specifically with regard to South Sudan, they had an agreement between the president of Sudan and at that time George Garang, and after that Salva Kiir. Although that has happened, but actually the conflict did not stop, and Sudan had split into two. So we had South Sudan. Still till now, we still have a problem because the conflict is not sorted out. As I said, the sort of the conflicts are the people. And any conflict has to address the people and has to focus on the people because the people are the center of the conflict. If we look at any conflict, we'll be looking at 6 elements that affecting this conflict. And this is in any conflict in the conflicting zones, especially in developing countries. And these 6 elements are political, that means conflicts could be due to 1, 2, 3, or all of these 6 elements. Could be political, economical, social, environmental, cultural, or human rights. Now, 5 of these elements, of the 6 elements, are linked with sustainable development. So when we talk about sustainable development, we talk about political, cultural, environmental, social, and economical. And of course, the 6th element is human rights. So in order to sort out the conflict has to address these issues and the solution has to come from the solution to these 6 elements with regard to the people who are the center of the conflict. Now, when we talk about the people, we're talking about any development. When you look at development, the target of the development is the individual or the people, and they are the tool for development. So accordingly, any country that looks into sustainable development with a human rights-based approach will be able to eliminate any kind of conflict or prevent the conflict or solve the conflict if the conflict had started. So when we say about conflict, why the conflict starts? I mentioned these 6 elements and how this conflict starts. What happened with the Arab Spring? Why did the Arab Spring started? What is the cause of that? Now, to be able to analyze the conflict or to predict that there will be a conflict, again, we have to look at certain indicators that will help us see that there will be a conflict. Usually countries, they rely more on certain index like Human Development Index to show the prosperity of that country and to see that this country is doing very well and as such, conflict might not happen. But if we look at the Human Development Index with regard to certain indicators, what we see, for example, if we look at the GDP per capita, a country could have a very high GDP per capita, but that does not mean every individual is very well off. It could be that the wealth distribution is not properly done in that country, and as such, it could be affected by a conflict that could happen. That's just an example. If we look at another example, if we look at the education in a country, and for example, if we say that the country had 90% of the people are educated above, for example, secondary education, that might look a very good indicator. It might look to the eyes of certain people that this country has a good record of education. But if we really apply, that's why I said that we have to apply the human right-based approach to development. And the human rights-based approach to development contains 5 elements that has to be applied. And these are 1, non-discrimination, 2, participation, 3, empowerment, 4, applying the rule of law pertaining to that human rights, and 5, accountability. Now, this human rights-based approach, or these 5 elements, have to be applied in the process itself and not on the outcome. That means when we again go back and talk about a country that has 90% of the people are educated, we have really to go and look at the process itself and ask ourselves, what happened to the 10%? Why this country doesn't have 100% of the people educated? When we look at the 10% and we apply the human rights-based approach, the 5 elements, and along the process, we might discover that this 10% comprise certain ethnic group that been exempted from education, or it could be a gender issue in which women are deprived from education, or certain minorities that have been deprived from education, or somebody in the rural areas have been deprived from education. So that's the non-discrimination part. Also, we have to look at empowerment. Have actually the government been able to empower everybody to reach or to have education? Or it actually did it for some and didn't do it for others? Then we have to look at participation. Is there really a participation of the people to decide and to be involved in their educational system and setting up the requirements of their education system? Also, we have to see if this country has actually signed certain agreements or they have certain laws pertaining to the education. Have these agreements or laws been applied in the process of the education system? And lastly, but not least, we have to look at accountability. Is there an accountability in terms of measures taken to apply the educational system? This is just an example of how you actually apply the human rights-based approach to development. And for each part of the process, you create an indicator. By looking that close inside, then we can arrive to a proper picture of what's happening in this country. The first indicator, which takes the number of educated people in the country, divided by the total population, which gave us the 90%, doesn't show us that there is a problem in this country. While if we apply the other measures which I have just talked about, the 5 elements, during the process of education, we could find that there are problems, and these problems could lead to a conflict, if not now, in the future. So this is with regard to the applying human rights-based approach to development. The other part, when we talk about human rights-based approach, we have to look at the responsibilities. So when we are talking about a right-based approach, then it is the right of people to get education and the right of the people to get health care. It's the right of the people to drink good water, clean water. And it's the duty of the government to provide good education, to provide good health care, to provide good housing, to provide good drinking water, etc. So the responsibility is fluctuating between 2 parts. One, which is a duty bearer, in this case, the government, and the right holder, which is, in this case, the people or the population. But this right-based approach also fluctuates and changes according to the positions. For example, a teacher will be, in this case, a duty bearer, and the students will be right holders. A father will be, or a mother will be a duty bearer, and the children will be right holders. This will create or change a system from a charity base to a right base, and will involve the people into taking their decision in providing their and providing guidelines and helping in shaping up their future. So when we look at, again, on the conflicts, why these conflicts started. As I said, what happened in the Arab Spring, what happened in conflicts in other zones, why these conflicts has started. If we look at the Arab Spring, if we look at the story itself of Al-Bouazizi when it started in Tunisia, I mean, the person was an engineer who was not been able to get a job, and he was selling vegetables or fruits on a cart. And then he was humiliated by a policeman or a policewoman and was slapped, and the cart was thrown on the side. This person thought that it's not just thinking that he didn't get a job or he's deprived from his earning, but he thought that he's worthless, that he has really no value in this society. He has no contribution, and he felt humiliated. So accordingly, he put fire to himself. So the feeling itself started from dignity. He felt that he has no dignity. So it's a human right that could be associated with a lot of other factors, economical, could be social, could be other elements that have started on this Arab Spring, which went from one country to another country. Now, that's one reason. When you look at, okay, that started, but what was wrong? Well, if we look at the developing countries, the real problem, that there is no comprehensive, sustainable development. Development is fragmented, and that fragmentation doesn't help these countries to grow. Why? Because as the individual in a developing country needs a holistic approach for development. So you cannot fragment development. You cannot say we either do this or that. We cannot say that it's education first, healthcare second, housing third. They are all important. So we have to look at the 5 elements which we talked about, which are, again, I repeat them. We have to look at the political system. We have to look at the environmental system. We have to look at the social, economical, and cultural. And we have to look at all of these together. So that development has to be comprehensive and all together. And also, this has to be applied, as I explained, in a human rights-based approach. Because this is where you can effectively measure the progress and to pinpoint if there is any violation of the human rights along the process of this development. So when we say that holistic, that means we have to take these all together holistically, and we cannot say one against the other. And some people say, for example, when you talk about human rights with respect of economy, they say, okay, what do you want? Is it freedom or you want the bread? Well, it is not this or that. They need freedom and bread. Because without freedom, the bread will have no taste. Accordingly, we have to look at, as I said, all these elements to look at how development is done. So if development is fragmented, that means you start with one thing, the other thing will fall down, and that was one of the reasons also for conflicts and one of the reasons for this Arab Spring. Of course, most of developing countries, remember that their economy is a rentier economy. That means the country depends on certain rents. It's not a productive economy. So this rents is collected by the government. This rents could be oil, it could be gas, it could be some minerals, it could be any sort of rents that's collected by the government. And the government decide how to distribute this wealth among the people and how to decide on the development by controlling this wealth. Accordingly, the government will decide how many schools to build, where these schools to be built, how many hospitals, how to run these hospitals, how many houses to be built for the people, and also it will mean that people will be more dependent on charity rather than be more productive. So it will eventually create a welfare society. Now, if we want to look at the, as I said, detecting the conflict, we have talked about how we can detect this conflict by using the human rights-based approach. But after that, we have to talk about how to do an analysis of a conflict. Let's assume that there is a conflict in a country, and we want to resolve or at least arrive to a solution to this conflict. Here we have to look at 5 main points. The first point is that we have to understand the reason and the core of the conflict. That means we have really to understand why this conflict has happened. And with this, we have to go back into history in a chronological order to find out how this conflict had started over the period of time. So number one, we have to understand the reason for the conflict and the history of that conflict. The second point is we have to look at the conflict and look at the stakeholders in this conflict. who are involved in the conflict locally? What are parties? Who are the parties? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4? And we have to identify all the stakeholders that in a way are contributing or part of this conflict. After identifying, because any conflict usually starts locally, and then what will happen after that? It will spread regionally. That means the region around will look and participate in this conflict. Usually they become part of the problem, not part of the solution for the conflict. After that, it will become international. International bodies will be involved in this conflict. So, going back to the points, the first point we said we have to understand the conflict. The second point, as I said, we have to identify who are the local stakeholders. The third point is we have to identify the regional parties involved in the conflict. And the other point, point also to look at the international partners or the parties that's actually involved in the conflict. And we have to sort of draw a map of the objectives of each of those stakeholders. So locally, we have to look at what are the objectives of each party involved or stakeholder involved in the conflict. What is their long-term and short-term strategy? How is the power balance between these parties? And we have to do the same thing also on the regional side. So who are the countries involved in this conflict? What are the interests, short-term and long-term, of these countries? What is the power balance between these countries? And the same thing for the international bodies that involved in the conflict. The last point is we have to look at the effect of media. Media now became part of the conflict because media is been used sometimes by local stakeholders, sometimes by regional stakeholders, sometimes by international stakeholders to project certain picture of that conflict. That picture might not be the true picture. It's not a true picture. It might be a biased picture. And with that, of course, with the media, and especially now the availability of media and social communication, that is a powerful tool to either help or stir a conflict. After we do all of that, then we have to go back and do an analysis of the conflict regarding what are, as I explained that at the beginning, that the conflict are usually attributed to 6 elements. And these elements, the 5 of them related to sustainable development, and the 6 is the human rights. I will say them again. It's political, environmental, social, economical, cultural, and human rights. Because these are the elements that affect the conflict, and because the people are the people who are actually targeted for the conflict. And as I said before, the conflicts are not resolved because it's missing the main target, which are the people. So the people are the target for the conflict. If we look at what's happening in Syria now, those refugees are the target. I mean, they are the people who are suffering from the conflict. And nobody, okay, there is some aid, there are tents provided, but that's not sustainable. These people have to go back and they have to earn their living and they have to raise their families. And that, so far, the conflict will not help that. And the conflict solution will not look deeply in how to make these things sustainable. I gave an example of Sudan, and Sudan have actually split into South Sudan, and the conflict still, even in the south, there is still conflict, as well as in the north, still conflict, and between the two, South Sudan and Sudan, there is still a conflict. So going back, when we look at that, we have to make a chart. And this chart will give us an indicator of what are the critical points that need to be addressed immediately pertaining to the conflict. To do that, we have to draw a chart with horizontal and vertical lines. On the vertical side, we're going from a low impact to a high impact. And on the horizontal side, we'll go into the dynamic of these elements. So we're going to draw a chart of these elements, the 6 elements pertaining to the conflict. And to do that, to do this chart, we have first to create a table looking at each element. For example, human rights. What are the elements? What are the points, the critical points related to human rights that is going on or part of this conflict? Is it freedom of press, freedom of speech? Is it people are not deprived from traveling? We have to put all the points that related to the conflict on that table. The second part is to look at, or the second element, we also do the same thing for the political. What are the political problems related to this conflict? Is it corruption, budget, succession? We have to put all these elements there. And then we have to do the same thing about environment, the same thing about economical, same thing about the social, the same thing about cultural. And we continue with the 6 elements, drawing that table with all the points, with all the critical points related to the conflict. Then after that, we draw them on the chart, which I said. The chart will have 2 axes, a vertical axis, which will have low from the bottom and high impact on the top. And then a horizontal axis in which we have the dynamics of the conflicting points. Because a conflict is usually dynamic. What's happening today might change tomorrow, it might become worse, or it might be the same, or it could stop. So we have to look at the dynamic uncertainty of the time factor. So on the right side, it will be the dynamic is high, the certainty is high, and on the left side, certainty is low. And then we draw all these points according to the high, low impact, and certainty in terms of high and low certainty. And then we focus on the top sort of quarter in which we have the high certainty with the high impact. And we take these elements, take these points, put them back on a table, and we can arrive at the points that, critical points that has to be addressed immediately to sort out or to start with the conflict. So if we go again just to summarize and to look at any conflict, we have to stress one point, that in order to solve a conflict, and in order the conflict, we have to eliminate that conflict or to prevent that conflict, we have really to focus on the main issue, which are the people. And through these people, we can focus on how to reach to those people, how to empower those people, and how to make sure that we apply the 6 elements which we talked about with regard to sustainable development and a human rights-based approach to development, to make sure that this country will stay stable, or if it is prone to conflict, the conflict could be stopped. And again, as I said, we have to look at that the solution has to be addressing to the people, talking to people, involving people, and with such things, we have to look at how we are handling our development and whether the development is fragmented or in a holistic approach. And of course, if it is fragmented, then we have to look at integrating the development and making sure that development reaching the individual, because the individual is the target for development and he or she is the tool for this development. And without that, we will not be able to arrive to a sustainable stability and sustainable peace, because the individual will be the one who will be actually affected and the one who will be participating in any conflict. And this is, of course, is something that has to be addressed, and addressed in a program. That program has to take into consideration all these elements. And it has to also chart down the human rights-based approach in which the participation of the people are important in their choice, in their decision of how this development will go. They have to be empowered. That means they have to be knowing and urging, the government urging them to participate and to know about their development system, whether it is education, healthcare, housing, you name it. Then there should be no discrimination. The minute there is a discrimination, then conflict will always start. So we have to apply a non-discrimination, and whether it's a gender discrimination or discrimination against minorities, ethnic groups, or rural areas. We have to apply the rule of law pertaining to any development program which we have, and we have to have proper accountability so that the people are accountable in every process of the development. With that, I end up this lecture. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.